Hello, and welcome to If Grapes Could Talk, your one and only source into the corrupt lives of wine country's elite. And who am I? Well, that's a secret I'll happily tell. My name is Rye Alexander, and I'm a former wine country insider trying to figure out how corrupt my home really is. Today's video, The Case Against Maureen Merrill, is the much anticipated deep dive into the election for the District 2 seat on Windsor Town Council this November 2022. For newer viewers, my corrupt hometown, Windsor, is a small town in Northern California's wine country with a population of about 26,000. Windsor made headlines last year in 2021 when it forced their now former mayor, Dominic Foppoli, to resign following multiple public allegations of sexual violence. Also worth noting that Dominic Foppoli is a winery owner, specifically Christopher Creek Winery, so stay away. Now, Foppoli, while not facing any criminal charges yet, fingers crossed that'll happen soon, he is facing 2 civil suits from, I believe, 8 plaintiffs total, and has been accused by at least 14 people of sexual misconduct. He is now 40. The allegations start when he was in college, and yeah, he is still not in jail. So I just want to say, before I lose my viewers who just don't care about this Windsor election, no matter how engaging I make this video, though even if you don't care, I think you'd be missing out if you didn't watch this video. I, Rye, the creator of this video, am the former tenant of Maureen Merrill, the subject of the video. And she knows about this video, and she is mad. She blocked me on Twitter within 2 hours of me announcing it. Her political ally and my nemesis, Debora Fudge, referred to me as unwell and called this channel slander on the social media platform Nextdoor. And Maureen's campaign secretary, Karen Alves, once said on my Facebook page, if Dominic Foppoli is an embarrassment, then so am I. And yeah, her allegiance to Dominic Foppoli is why we're not friends anymore. So this isn't your average YouTube deep dive into some niche topic. This is the manifestation of a hometown feud that has been bubbling to the surface since 2015, at least 2015. But if that still doesn't entice you, and you've been dying for non-Windsor content, I promise you, this is my last video about Windsor. Unless there's something major that I got wrong in this video and I need to issue a retraction or correction or what have you, this is my last Windsor video. And why am I moving on? Last spring, by now, I wanted to be getting into how influential and powerful the trustees at Sonoma Academy really are. I wanted to be looking into the fight over Measure P, demanding better police oversight in Sonoma County, and so much more. And I really wanted to now be getting to the point where I can explain to you how those things are all connected, which I obviously can't yet. But that's where I'm headed next. And if you just want to wait for that and not spend an hour and a half learning about Windsor, now's a good time to exit. And to the residents of Windsor, I'll say this. While I have your attention, I want to share this video with you. A ridiculously long entry in the journal that is this YouTube channel, in which I tell people why Maureen Merrill is symbolic of all of the reasons that I need to break up with Windsor politics. That doesn't mean this is a sad video. Sometimes the happiest ending is to break up. This doesn't mean I won't be talking about him, Dominic Foppoli. It also doesn't mean the information won't be helpful to Windsor residents. Like I said, it's all connected. And part of our problem in Windsor is how the economic potential of us essentially being wine country real estate attracts attention from people with money and power, and you kind of have to have some amount of money and power to be effectively corrupt. So with those big picture caveats out of the way, let's discuss the episode's specific caveats before I dive into it. So caveat 1 is, what do I mean by corrupt? I'll be calling people corrupt when they are putting their personal interests ahead of some sort of obligation to their community, to an institution, something like that. To the point they engage in pretty universally accepted as unethical behavior, such as lying, physical assault, covering up physical assault. But it's important to note that I'm not talking about illegal behavior. I'm talking about unethical behavior, and I think if we have all experienced throughout our lives, ethical and legal are not synonyms. This is not a set definition, and I imagine my definition of corrupt will change over time. Caveat 2. My DMs indicate that a lot of people jumped to conclusions and thought me making a video called The Case Against Maureen Merrill meant I was going to endorse Salmon, who is actually our current mayor and also her opponent for the District 2 seat in the upcoming election. That is a false assumption. The title, The Case Against Maureen Merrill, is a response to Sonoma County's main newspaper, the Press Democrat, essentially writing the case for Maureen Merrill when they released their first article about her candidacy. Now, I was not the only one who found this article biased, as we can see from this comment here. Press Democrat, first to endorse a candidate, even prior to her being nominated. So yeah, I was not alone in seeing red flags in that Press Democrat article. Indeed, if the Press Democrat had looked into its own archives and reported on them, I never would have felt a need to make this video. And to make my points, unless otherwise noted, all of the information about 1990s Windsor is pulled from the Press Democrat archives, which I had to access through the Sonoma County Library. I will at some point show a screenshot of I think every article that I used, but the image quality of the archive can be a bit all over the place. So in addition to screenshots, I will have a list of the article titles, dates, and pages of everything that I cite so that you can look into those further if you want to. Caveat 3, I just want to adjust your expectations. As I just alluded to, a lot of this video is about Windsor in the 1990s, and I think people might be expecting more of a deep dive into Maureen Merrill's life specifically, but seeing as she is a founding town council member, I chose to focus really on that time in her life instead of like bringing in aspects of her personal life, because believe it or not, I'm not that petty. Caveat 5, the production value of this video is a reflection of the fact that I'm still learning, and I appreciate your continued kindness and patience while I work with what I have so that I can still produce content for you while I'm still learning. But I really do think this is a fantastic video, but yeah, I'm still learning. And my final caveat is a caveat I make every time. This is about real corruption and can therefore be quite upsetting. I've already touched on the theme of sexual violence. I will continue to touch on that theme, and if that's not something you're up for, that's totally understandable. I'll give you a second to click away. So without further ado, let's jump into Chapter 1 of the Case Against Maureen Merrill, Windsor Incorporated. To cover the full history of Maureen Merrill's political career in Windsor, let's jump in the time machine back to 1990. Coincidentally, that's the year I was born, but more importantly, it was the year a group called Citizens for Windsor submitted the proposal that would ultimately lead to the incorporation of the city of Windsor in 1992. And already it's kind of confusing to talk about the incorporation process, because when you incorporate in the state of California, you are becoming a city. So they were incorporating into cityhood, but their city was named the Town of Windsor. Like, our government is literally called the Town of Windsor. Our website is townofwindsor.com. My family business images on the Windsor town green. So it really did blow my mind to realize that we're technically a city, even though that may just seem like semantics. And whether or not you want Windsor to really lean into townhood, you can't deny that it makes it confusing to talk about. Before July 1992, the future city limits of Windsor had been governed by the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, aka the local elected county government. Enter our star, Maureen Merrill. At the time, she was actually known as Maureen McDaniel. Merrill is her current husband, Mike Merrill's last name. It's not her first husband, and no, we are not getting into the history of her marriages, not the point here. And Maureen Merrill is going to be a key figure in Windsor's incorporation. She ran for and secured a place on Windsor's inaugural town council. So what's Maureen Merrill like? As I said, Maureen Merrill is my former landlady, so I have had more human interaction with her than the average voter. To paint a picture for those who don't know her, I would call her a combination of Cersei from Game of Thrones' overconfidence, Lord Farquaad from Shrek's commitment to happy, happy, joy, joy, and Alice from the L Word's quirky personal style. I do respect the Floral Blazer game and am playing homage. So let's see how a candidate like that might fare in an inaugural election. Because any candidate's seat on town council was obviously contingent on voters choosing incorporation and therefore choosing to have a town council, most of the candidates were pro-incorporation, and Maureen Merrill was no exception. For some reason, I really did believe that Windsor didn't have much going on before incorporation. Again, I was born in 1990, so I would have no memory of what was going on. But, you know, when I started poking around the Press Democrat, I couldn't help but notice there actually was quite a bit going on. We had a water board, we'd had a Chamber of Commerce since 1965, and these were not inconsequential bodies. The water board had a multi-million-dollar budget, more on that later, and in 1990, the school gave permanent status to a Spanish language immersion program. It appears the program was cutting edge in the sense that the state was providing the school grants to do the research to provide data that might have other schools adapt this successful language immersion program. All of that is to say, Windsor was doing cool things before incorporation. There were people here doing cool things, advocating for their community, and doing things that were cutting edge. The formal push for incorporation began on February 7th, 1990, when a group called Citizens for Windsor presented their proposal to, I'm just gonna read this, Sonoma County's Local Agency Formation Commission, which I will be referring to as LAFCO from now on because that is much more fun to say and remember than Sonoma County's Local Agency Formation Commission. Yeah, I'm never gonna remember that. So yeah, they submitted to LAFCO. And I would speculate that Maureen Merrill was a member of Citizens for Windsor, the organization that submitted the proposal for incorporation, but it would have to be speculation. I found absolutely no confirming evidence. Either way, she was a public proponent of incorporation. In a July 1st, 1991 letter to the editor, she writes, "Cityhood would mean local government by a responsive, accountable town council made up of 5 Windsor residents instead of representation by 1 county supervisor with an office full of other responsibilities." Which, yeah, I think that's a super fair claim. And I, were I not learning to walk and not drool constantly, I would have been a toddler in 1992, I would have been swayed by the idea that 5 representatives from Windsor on a Windsor Town Council would be better for our community than 1 elected official that other people that didn't even live in Windsor were voting for. However, I had to raise an eyebrow when at the end of the letter she writes, "We have plans in place for measured growth." Maureen, who exactly is we? And what exactly is measured growth? To me, she writes as though this we have already decided what is best for Windsor's voters before they've even got incorporation passed on the ballot. Citizens for Windsor's initial proposal includes 1,700 signatures, far more than the 500 required. However, it certainly doesn't mean that this petition represented the approximately 9,700 residents living in the future city limits at the time. It seems Citizens for Windsor had learned from a failed attempt at incorporation, in 1978, when the measure was rejected by 80% of voters. It seems proponents rushed the initiative and therefore weren't really able to reach a broad range of Windsor residents. This time, they had sought to build a coalition that includes minorities, homemakers, residents new and old, and business. That being said, a June 1991 article kind of indicates that Windsor had a literal West Side Story segregation problem. Residents on the west side of Windsor, predominantly Latine, worried that incorporation would focus on development on the east side of Windsor, rather than revitalizing the downtown in West Windsor where they lived. And I call this a West Side Story segregation problem because the west side was apparently unloved enough by local county that it was referred to as a ghetto. Which, again, how can you claim to be a charming small town when your local paper says that your segregation problem is bad enough that you have a west side ghetto that is racialized? Plans were already in place to open a new shopping center on the east side, where, coincidentally, yes, there were wealthier, whiter residents. And feasibility studies, for the financial feasibility of incorporating Windsor, used sales tax projections based on the completion of that shopping center. Okay, back to LAFCO, the organization that Citizens for Windsor needed to impress if they wanted to get their proposal for incorporation onto the ballot. LAFCO was made up of 2 Sonoma County supervisors, 2 city council members from local city councils, and 1 at-large member. The most notable member of LAFCO at that time was Sonoma County Supervisor Nick Esposti, who was the supervisor representing Windsor on the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, the main Sonoma County government at the time. He would go on to donate to at least one of the founding Windsor Town Council members' campaign, which just a tinge of corruption there. Can't put my finger on it, but tinge. I also think Nick Esposti, the person who was currently representing Windsor, donating to a future town council member, kind of starts to indicate who the we might have been in Maureen Merrill's letter when she was talking about this we that has a plan for Windsor already. And LAFCO did eventually approve the proposal, but the initiative didn't make it into the ballot until November 1991, and they had been hoping for March 1991. All right, this is when you know that it's getting serious. I'm shedding layers. I'm moving because the light has changed and I was getting those weird blind things on my face, but we're getting back to it now. I was explaining why incorporation didn't make it onto the March 1991 ballot. It got on the November ballot. So from what I can tell, the stall was because the entity known as the Windsor Water District, in the initial proposal by Citizens for Windsor, the Windsor Water District would immediately merge with the Windsor Town Council upon incorporation. And members of the water board were worried that this would make the water district budget vulnerable to being redirected to other projects. And so they submitted a counter proposal that would still allow for incorporation, but would allow 5 years for the merger of the town council and the water district to happen, and for those budgets to converge. At least that's my understanding of the situation. Correct me if I'm wrong. So why would anyone want control over the budget of what is essentially 10,000 people's sewer system? Well, because that budget was $8 million over 5 years. Today, that would be $18,170,000 over 5 years. So quite the chunk of change. And I think part of the reason that budget was so big was because the county, the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, in their infinite wisdom, had essentially allowed housing permits for the building of housing that couldn't be built and hooked up to a sewer system. So Windsor needed more sewers in order to make good on these housing permits. And basically why were people worried about the merging of the budget? They were worried that the water district budget would be taken away from these very important sewage projects and, put towards things like buildings. And again, I don't understand. It just seems like sewers then buildings shouldn't have been that complicated. Despite all this, by December 1990, it does seem the Water Board and Citizens for Windsor had reached an agreement. After LAFCO told the Water Board that if they did want to submit a separate proposal, then they would have to fund half of the environmental impact study the county would need to do as part of approving Windsor's attempt at incorporation. So basically not wanting to have to foot the bill for this impact study, and with Citizens for Windsor agreeing to scale back growth in their proposal, like the actual development building of housing growth, they reached an agreement. And so as 1990 turned into 1991, Windsor residents had to ponder, do we want to be a city? Do we want to be a town? See, I told you, it's confusing. Not even halfway through chapter 1, I am Downy Blazer, I have my fan out. Alright, so both campaigns for and against incorporation spent big money. As of October 29th, 1991, about a week before the election, the combined totals, so combined for both sides, were $62,000 raised, $57,000 spent. That would be equivalent to $126,000 spent in 2022, or $18 spent on each of the approximately 7,000 registered voters. $18 seems like a lot to me. So for comparison, I once looked into how much Dominic Foppoli's mayoral campaign in 2020 spent, I think, per resident, and that was $3 per person. So yeah, if $3 is a lot, and even though that was 2 sides, okay, 3 times 2, that's 6, that's still a lot less than 18. And this is how Windsor is getting started. These are the sides for and against incorporation, and the tone that is being set is we're spending a lot on elections. Maureen Merrill did not seem to see a problem with this exorbitant spending, going on to be the largest spender herself. Most of the $9,000 that she raised was a $6,000 loan from herself. $6,000, roughly $13,000 today. So I don't know, just kind of take a second, sit back, like what would it be like to spend $13,000 of your own money on a campaign for a seat on your local city, town council, or what have you? It's interesting. For the most part in this election, most of these big fundraising dollars were spent on mailers, like little postcards that are sent to people's homes. I'm not sure about Maureen, to be honest with you, but definitely the pro and anti groups for incorporation. A tactic that persists to this day, much to my disdain. So let's talk about the money behind the pro and anti groups. The pro group was Windsor Incorporation Now, which is WIN when you acronym it. And then obviously there was Citizens for Windsor that had submitted the initial proposal. And then the anti group was Sonoma County Conservation Action, SCCA. So I have to say that the pro group wins in terms of names that are fun to say and remember. WIN, Citizens for Windsor on the one hand, Sonoma County Conservation Action on the other hand. Notably, most of the more developer donors for WIN and Citizens for Windsor, they made last-minute donations that the state did not legally require that these last-minute donations be disclosed before the actual election. So whether intentional or not, just, you know, suspicious, weird behavior. But yeah, donors that I found the most interesting were the Sonoma County Alliance, an organization serving the business interests of Sonoma County, the Windsor Chamber of Commerce, a organization serving the business interests of Windsor, Oaks National Bank, which Maureen's husband, Mike Merill, was a director of, one of many directors. He actually eventually became vice chairman in 1995. And please note, the success of Oaks National Bank was kind of determined by the continued growth in Windsor. More residents in Windsor opening personal bank accounts, businesses that serve them, obviously opening business accounts. So claims that incorporation was backed by business interests, developers, valid. They were valid. Now let's see who was funding Sonoma County Conservation Action. And honestly, I found this just confusing. The most recognizable donor was Peanuts creator Charles Schultz's widow, Jeannie Schultz. I'm just gonna put that over there because I don't understand and I don't have time. But aside, like, Snoopy is a really big deal in Sonoma County. I mean, the airport is the Charles M. Schultz Airport, and there's like Snoopys all over the place, and Windsor has its very own Snoopy. It's actually a rainbow Snoopy. Here's a story that's just very like chef's kiss, indicative of how sometimes it was difficult to be a LGBTQ person in Windsor. So we have a rainbow Snoopy. And I remember being very emphatically told that the rainbow represented the fruits and the vegetables available for sale at the farmer's market, not gay people. Gay people do not have a monopoly on rainbows, which is just such a thing to say. But besides Jean Schultz, no one stood out to me. A homemaker from San Anselmo, weird. There were some people that the Press Democrat referred to as conservationists, but overall they really just don't get points for transparency. So on October 29th, 1990, the PD reported that they claimed spending of less than $1,000, but they had a payroll of $9,000, including a salary for an executive director. And it's not just the money or the lack of transparency around the money that makes most sides look like they have hidden agendas. It's the content of the mailers. Okay, I closed my blinds, and I think this should be the last place that I move to for the video. So I was saying how both sides, pro and anti-incorporation campaigns, I'm not loving where the money is coming from, but it's not just the money or the lack of transparency around the money. It was the content of the mailers. These mailers contained such conflicting claims that voters just didn't know who to believe. And a lot of what made them so confusing was the emotional language in them. This October 6, 1991 article in the PD, they're talking about a pro-incorporation camp's mailers, very much leaning into Windsor as this homey, small-town charm thing, even though, again, very confusing here, we're actually going for cityhood. Maureen Merrill very much leaned into the rhetoric. She was definitely someone who enjoyed thinking of Windsor as being a small town. She was a member of a Pride in Windsor committee who tackled such important things as planting flowers and covering up graffiti. And it's really disingenuous when you consider this hometown pride shtick, and she's only lived in Windsor for 2 years. Not that the other side was like great. Mark Green, a key opponent of incorporation, said that Windsor would become a crack baby addicted to growth. Charming turn of phrase there, Mark. And here's where things get kind of funny in the PD. They quote Walt Kaiser, a lead researcher on town feasibility, basically studying whether a town of Windsor would be financially viable. He called Green's claim about the potential future of Windsor as utter horseshit. The article in which I read this quote notes that Kaiser is a professor at UC Berkeley, whereas Mark Green was a former valedictorian at the Santa Rosa Junior College. Green's claims were based on a version of Citizens for Windsor's proposal that allowed for the development of 300 new homes per year, and the number had actually been scaled back to 100 new homes per year. And whether it was 300 or 100, I think it's worth noting that both numbers would have been significantly less than the 500 that the county had allowed. It cannot be denied that under county supervision, Windsor's growth had gotten out of control in the 1980s. Pretty much everyone I spoke to who lived here at the time said that they remember it being out of control. And I have questions just about the nature of the debate around the 300 versus 100 versus 500 homes. What is the point of incorporating and like having a town council if they're not going to be able to decide what the actual like growth number of houses ends up being? I'm confused, and I can definitely see why, as the PD reported, Windsor voters were saying they were confused. So Maureen Merrill was campaigning for that inaugural town council seat. She was one of 15 candidates. All but one supported incorporation. This makes sense. In order for them to get their position on town council, people have to incorporate to create town council. And while many of these candidates would go on to get into bitter debates with their colleagues once elected, it does appear that there was some level of coordination amongst the pro-incorporation candidates. For example, a letter where they're essentially promising rent control for folks in mobile park homes. I would have totally supported that. I didn't find any evidence of them following through on that. Anyone please correct me if I'm wrong. And Windsor has an incredibly progressive rent control measure for mobile home parks. But regardless of whether I did it or not, I bring up this letter as evidence that the pro-incorporation candidates, the 14 of them, including Maureen Merrill, had some level of coordination. The first mention of Maureen Merrill specifically as a candidate within the Press Democrat I found, on August 12, 1991. She is framed as a freelance writer and self-described entrepreneur. And the self-described, I think, is a dig at the fact that, Maureen is a businesswoman. She owns businesses, but I wouldn't say that she's done anything creative or groundbreaking enough for her to be considered an entrepreneur. By her October 28, 1991 bio, she had been updated to business editor. And in these bios, her main selling point was that she could be a communication bridge between government and business. And when all was said and done, on November 5th, 1991, 53% of Windsor voters voted for incorporation, and voila, so it eventually was in July. And Maureen Merrill was chosen as one of those 5 inaugural members of Windsor Town Council. Perhaps the most shocking thing to me in this whole thing is that she did so with 9.3% of the vote. 9.3%, that is less than 10%. And again, Maureen Merrill spent $9,000 on getting 9.3% of the vote. The other inaugural town council members were Mayor Joe Rodata, and then Barbara Siegler, Alan Rolland, and Julie Adamson. And it just kind of seemed like, based on what their platforms were, that voters supported modest investment in small business development and a focus on services for family and youth. Like parks, after-school programs, probably sewers. And then remember when I said Sonoma County Supervisor Nick Esposti actually donated to one of their campaigns? That was Joe Rodata, who actually, yes, went on to be mayor and a key liaison working with Nick Esposti once they were working on the transitional government. I had to charge my camera. It cooled down a little bit, so the blazer is back on. So, more on Nick Esposti. Though popular, this conservative politician eventually stopped running for office after receiving so much criticism from a grand jury. He said they had a vendetta against him. And the criticism was mostly for blocking the crackdown of a lumber mill operating without permits. And then he also blocked his staff from, and I quote, taking legal action against the owners of a huge pile of tires that burned near the county airport. So many questions. But again, he did seem very popular, and when he did retire because of the vendetta and the grand jury, the candidate that he endorsed ended up filling the position. And he was the first honorary citizen of the city-town of Windsor. So to give you a sense of where his head was at in assisting with the transition, here's a quote. He said, "We can't go out and deny a permit because the school district has problems." Which, though probably technically correct, Windsor voters agree on very little across the board, but they care about families, they care about schools, they care about kids, and so phrasing something that way just seems like not the way to endear yourself to the new citizens of Windsor. But I could also see how, if I am correctly reading into a tone of frustration there, he may very well have been frustrated with the lack of experience that the inaugural 5 town council members were bringing. So let's see, the mayor, Joe Rodata, that he had donated to, he had the most experience in government. Let's see, he had served as the Sonoma County Parks Director for 25 years, and then Alan Rollins was a former administrator for LA's mental health department. But I still believe that's no like elected government experience. And if I'm correct on them not having any experience as elected officials, that's a red flag to me, because supposedly when you're an elected official as opposed to a business owner, you don't have the option to refuse service to anyone. Supposedly. You know, obviously doesn't always play out that way in practice. Additionally, like Maureen Merrill, Joe Rodata and Rollin had lived in Windsor for less than 3 years. But at the end of the day, we can't take it away from her or any of them. Congratulations on being the inaugural members of the Windsor Town Council. Now, she doesn't mention this as much, but both she and Rollin were also elected to the Windsor Water District Board. And in that election, she actually managed 16% of the vote. And before they were even sworn in as town council members, Rollins and Merill had their hands on water district funds. Per a April 6th, 1992 article in the Press Democrat, they wouldn't even start their stints on town council until July. And so the town attorney actually did go on to say Merill and Rollins were within their rights to be spending this money. And even after the attorney steps in to defend them, their colleague, Floyd Coakley, he continued to express his opposition. So Merill tried to pass an amendment that would allow her and Rollins to essentially get rid of him. And yes, he was a democratically elected official. He'd been voted into office just like them, and she ultimately was forced to back down from her crusade to get rid of him after he threatened litigation. And yeah, he referred to that experience as a witch hunt. And she positions herself as this warrior for Windsor who, you know, is working for a smooth transition, and that's why she had to fight back against Coakley. And to me, that's just petty and counter to what her goal is. I don't see the villainry in Coakley being defensive over the budget. They would have known that this was going to be a problem, and they could have gone into this with a more diplomatic mindset. So besides feuding with a colleague on the Water District Board, Merill continued to write letters to the editor. This seems to be a favorite pastime of hers throughout her life. She wrote one in January 5th, and she was criticizing the newspapers for being overly critical of politicians. And her thesis statement, I suppose, I can get behind. She's ultimately saying that newspapers shouldn't come down on a politician for admitting they were wrong. And I can certainly agree with that. However, I have to raise my eyebrow at what is essentially a letter from a recently elected official telling newspapers to be nice to elected officials. And then just later that month, January 26th, she's encouraging people to get involved in local government. I 100% would also encourage people to get involved in local government. Big picture, Merill and I agree there. But again, I have to raise an eyebrow at her assertion that we tolerate extremists and listen to people with passion, but ultimately should ignore them. I think it's very telling that she sees herself as the arbiter of who is and isn't worth listening to. And she doesn't base it on the content of their appeal. She's not basing this on logic, on, personal investment. So if I just take that letter to the editor at face value, I don't like that in an elected official. And yes, I just want to acknowledge what I'm sure would be a common criticism. She wrote those many, many years ago. She may very well feel differently. I encourage you to ask her. However, in my experience, whenever you ask her a question that indicates you don't think she's the best thing since sliced bread, she kind of starts to treat you like an extremist. And she's still spinning the same yarn or selling the same line or whatever in the Press Democrat editorial section. Now, in a recent Press Democrat editorial, she rejects the notion that Windsor Town officials don't care about them. And she suggests that the conflicts between the residents of Windsor and the public officials they think really let them down can just be boiled down to a difference of opinion. And she doesn't see how her ability to discount all of that very valid rage by reducing it to and minimizing it by calling it a difference of opinion is actually very clear evidence that they're right and she does in fact not care about them. To the point I think she doesn't realize that they too are members of the public, that angry residents of Windsor are still residents of Windsor. So in conclusion, Maureen Merrill was an early proponent of incorporation. Her husband's business stood to financially benefit from said incorporation. She went on to become one of the first elected officials in Windsor once incorporated. And before even starting her term as town council member, she was already trying to oust political opponents through, bureaucratic bullying? Oh, and she was also very obsessed with the whole Windsor is a quaint little hometown shtick, which just seems at odds with everything that I just said. So let's see if she learned to play better with others once she started her actual stint on town council. Chapter 2, the town council years. Officially sworn in July 1st, 1992, the inaugural Windsor Town Council's main job. Okay, so remember the whole, is Windsor going to allow 100, 300, 500 homes per year? Big question. Windsor's growth had ballooned in the 80s and then just kind of had to slow down because of a lack of a proper sewage situation. So the plan as of July 1st, 1990 seems to be 400 homes per year for 3 years, so a total of 1,200 homes over those 3 years. But there was some room in there for renegotiation within reason. Again, I think confusing. Regardless of that negotiation, the question for right now is how cozy was Maureen Merrill with developers? It's kind of always the main criticism of her, and she gets super defensive about it. So if you don't want to come across as cozy with developers, maybe on day one, don't advocate for a developer, a San Diego-based developer, not even a locally based developer, be given an exception to this 400 home per year rule. Asking for exceptions on day one makes you look cozy with developers. Fortunately, folks like Mayor Joe Rodata pointed out that it probably would set the wrong tone to start handing out exceptions on day one. Later that month, so still her first month in office, Merill came across as out of touch to environmentalists or just, people who like trees, with her philosophical, as the Press Democrat put it, response to some beautiful oak trees needing to be destroyed for the expansion of the 101, I believe it was. Oh, I'm sorry, it was 12 sycamore trees, not oak trees. Residents had planted these sycamore trees themselves, so they were very upset when the trees were just thrown on the side of the roads. They were, basically seeing these trees' bodies, their trunks decaying, and Maureen just says, that's the thing about trees, you can make more of them, they reproduce. And this is where the Lord Farquaad from Shrek vibes come from. There's a scene, spoiler alert I guess, where he's having a tournament fight to the death to select a champion, and so he says, some of you may die, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. That's the energy I get with Maureen Merrill saying, that's the thing about trees, they reproduce, and so do people. Even later that month, on July 24th, so again, still her first month in office, Maureen Merrill indicated in the PD, in the Press Democrat, that she intended to select a Windsor Town, planning commissioner, so someone who had a lot of power over the future of development in Windsor. She wanted to appoint a developer who didn't even live in Windsor yet. His name was Jeff Sivian, and he was a partner in the brand new Lakewood Village and a top employee of Oakmont Developers. If you don't want to come across as cozy with developers, don't pick him to be on the planning commission. And then on the 27th, she was quoted suggesting Windsor stop collecting upfront fees from developers. Now, this was to encourage low-income housing, so theoretically a little bit more acceptable. But, given everything else that she'd done, I find it hard to believe that she was purely motivated by wanting low-income housing in Windsor. So by December, the end of that year, the growth, development, debates, wars raged on in Windsor, and Maureen Merrill was already very disillusioned. Nobody's going to be happy with whatever we decide. So it sounds like she doesn't see a possibility of being able to create something that people could come together on. Okay, let's see what she got up to in 1993. Windsor shouldn't invest in preserving a historic landmark, the aptly named landmark Vineyards, because, and I quote, a good half of Windsor has never laid eyes on it. Are they willing to pay for it? And I'm guessing that half of Windsor she was referring to were the more recent transplants like herself, and just how out of touch with this kitschy hometown shtick. I'm calling it that from her. I think there are people that genuinely have lived in Windsor for a long time and appreciate that hominess of it. But from her, who had only been there for 3 years, and then she's saying that she shouldn't have to pay for historic landmarks, those things are in conflict with each other, Maureen. Like, how do you not see that? All right, that got me all worked up. Blazer off, fan out. So that brings us to 1994. An election year. To keep her seat on Windsor Town Council, Maureen Merrill would have to run against, dun dun dun, Salmon. That's right, Windsor's current mayor and her current opponent for the District 2 seat. So I was 4, and now at 32, the same two people are running. At least with these early elections where, okay, downside, you have people getting elected with 10%, 9% of the vote. Upside, you have 10 people to choose from, so there's more likelihood that you can choose someone who actually accurately represents your interests. Whereas right now, we have 2 candidates that people find too entrenched in the system to be able to represent them. And in the end, in this 1994 election, Salmon did win, as did Lynn Morehouse, remember that name, and Marjorie Smith. They all defeated Merill, as well as her fellow incumbent Barbara Ziegler, who were both kind of seen as really pro-growth candidates. And yeah, the 3 people that beat them were seen as anti-growth or pro-environmental. And so, you could see where the majority of voters' heads were at and who they selected. So let's take a closer look at that 1994 election. So on the one hand, council members like Merill, Barbara Ziegler, who I mentioned, and then Julie Adamson, they privileged development. And on the other hand, Mayor Joe Rodata and council member Alan Rolland, they actually just kind of seem to find the antics of, in particular, Merill and Ziegler to be ridiculous. Let me explain. In October 1994, Town Council unanimously passed a $10,000 survey, a bit expensive for a survey, to send to residents for input on what the future of Windsor should look like. And it also, again, just also seems like that maybe should have been done sooner. And in the lead up to that survey's final approval, emotions had run high. In public hearings, one of Merrill's allies, Julie Adamson, told an angry resident to just grow up. And that kind of like development side, they initially refused to pass the survey unless some questions with pro-business spin on them were added. And they said that they believed these questions needed to be added in order to meet their definition of balanced and thought-provoking. Mayor Joe Rodata refused to these questions as eyewash and an insult to the people of Windsor. But he eventually, I guess, acquiesced so that the survey would make it out to voters and they could get some feedback. So she was perceived as having blocked this survey. She's perceived as cozy with developers. She did seem kind of flustered in the 1994 election. She and her ally, Barbara Siegler, criticized a mailer that was sent to 2,000 Windsor residents, calling them reckless and closed to feedback. And they saw this as an unnecessary and inaccurate attack, and the mailer did endorse their rivals in the election, Lynn Morehouse and Sam Salmon. My personal opinion on these kinds of mailers is that they should stop. But I will say that like both sides from the beginning, and I'll stop harping on this now, they just seem to both be taking this ends justify the means reasoning and leaning into the drama and just, yeah, really like making the discourse dramatic and over the top, and it's bad for Windsor and they're both responsible. This particular offending mailer, that was funded by Sonoma County Conservation Action. If that sounds familiar, it's because it was that kind of shady group from the incorporation election year run by Mark Green, the former SRJC valedictorian and the guy who would make the "Windsor will be a crack baby" quote. And then it was also supported by Citizens for a Better Windsor, not to be confused with Citizens for Windsor. And yeah, both Salmon and Morehouse were involved in Citizens for a Better Windsor, so not a good look. They were endorsed by a group they were in. Also worth mentioning, Morehouse and Sam Salmon both received $575 worth of signs from Citizens for a Better Windsor. And I guess to be fair, Merrill's main criticism of these types of mailers is that she never personally claimed to be for mega growth. From the beginning, her very first letter to the editor before she's even running, she's talking about, we have a plan for measured growth. What she'll do and other founding town council members will do is they will speak to the fact that they did slow down growth, which they did. They slowed down growth from the historic high in the 80s. However, that's kind of like if someone was buying like 400 t-shirts a year and then they were able to get it down to 100 t-shirts per year. Most likely their t-shirt collection is still wildly unreasonable to the average t-shirt consumer. That's kind of where Windsor was at with their like housing development growth. So all in all, it was not shocking to me that she was defeated. What was shocking to me was how much less money she spent on this campaign. Her previous campaign, she had raised $9,000, $6,000 of which was a loan from her own money. This time she only raised $3,000 and only $600 of that came, from her own purse essentially. I honestly get the impression she didn't really like being on town council, and the feeling was mutual with the public. And in considering her defeat, Merill said, there was a larger anti-growth sentiment than we thought. Gee, if only town council could have gotten out a survey that would have told her that, maybe she could have avoided her defeat. But yeah, so in conclusion, Maureen kind of ignored the voices of residents and didn't get elected to town council again. So let's move on to see how she handled defeat. Chapter 3, Revenge. This fan doesn't really do a dramatic thing like I wanted to do. Chapter 3, Revenge. I'm really excited for this particular chapter because current Windsor Town Council member Debora Fudge, who her campaign fund has donated to Maureen Merrill's campaign fund, she accused me of slander on Nextdoor. And I can now reveal why reading that she had accused me of slander made me laugh out loud so hard I started crying. And that's because I knew that in my upcoming Maureen Merrill script, I would be discussing the fact that Maureen Merrill printed slanderous information in a newspaper she owned about a political opponent that she actually then had to retract. So yes, Maureen Merrill owned a newspaper, and tragically I have not been able to find archives. But yeah, so here's what happened. 3 local developers, Larry Wassam, current owner of the Airport Business Center, former business partner of Maureen's husband Mike Merrill, Richard Carnation, another super fun name. He's a businessman, founder of Waterworks Industries, and he's currently on the school board, I believe. And then Marvin DeAngelis, I didn't find much about him, although there was one PD article. He said he felt sick making money flipping houses following the housing crash. So glad you feel bad about your blood money, Marvin. So those three developers decided to look for dirt on Lynn Morehouse, who, yes, was one of the people that essentially ousted Maureen Merrill from her position on town council, advocating for less growth. Yeah, so they decided a PI to look up dirt on her, on their political opponent, which is a super not corrupt sounding thing to do. They hired that PI. The PI made a fake subpoena to USC for Morehouse's academic records. USC provided those academic records, and they were inaccurate academic records, stating that Morehouse did not have an MBA when in fact she did have an MBA. So the three developers took this fraudulently acquired fake information, took it to Maureen Merrill, allegedly anonymously. I don't believe it, but I think that's what we have to say. And she published it, and because it was false information, she had to retract it. So yeah, is it just me, or is that pretty corrupt? Engaging in unethical behavior for personal gain. Anyway, slander was not all that Morehouse would face after her defeat of Maureen Merrill. Morehouse, along with Salmon and newly elected at that time Council Member Debora Fudge, dun dun dun, that's how far back now all of these people are that are still in Windsor politics go, they were all put up for a recall vote. That's right, Windsor had been incorporated for 4 years and already we have a bitter recall election. That's also not very on brand for like a cute little small town. It's important to note for like what's going on now that if we simplify the recall election to like pro-business, pro-environment, that Salmon and Fudge were on the same side at that time. They were on the anti-recall side at the very least. And just like Merrill's slanderous newspaper article, it was speculated that one of the motivating factors of the recall was there was like this whole debacle where town council decided not to go into private business with the sewer system, and that made like a golf course not happen. To quote the Press-Democrat, the motivation was reversing a decision to extend the town's sewers to Shiloh Meadows, a proposed golf resort in the hills east of town. So yeah, they like really wanted that golf course. And to be fair, like while the recall side was recycling a lot of talking points from like early incorporation campaigns, I actually didn't find a lot of evidence that the recall effort was particularly well funded to begin with and that it was funded by the same people. Again, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I looked for it, I didn't find it. Irregardless, it can't be denied that the recall in a way seems a logical consequence of the bitterness and the drama of the initial incorporation election. And the recall was bitter. Journalist Steve Hart writes in December 1997, as the campaign enters its final 2 weeks, the two sides are accusing each other of using scare tactics and twisting the facts about Windsor's government. The fight has grown personal, with two council members, Marjorie Smith and Steve Scott, calling for their colleagues' removal. Can you imagine what town council meetings would be like when there's two people who think that like each other should be removed? In the recall election, the town sided with Maureen Merrill's then political opponents, Debora Fudge and Salmon. Now, of course, Salmon is Merrill's political opponent in her current election, and Debora Fudge has essentially donated to Merrill's campaign fund. And again, to be clear, I did not find evidence that she was involved in the recall process, but she and two former colleagues, they wrote the Press-Democrat to complain that it was unfair that team like getting recalled Salmon, Morehouse, Fudge were getting classified as the slow growth candidates. And this would not be the last time that she wrote the Press-Democrat to complain that founding members of the town council are not getting their due, their credit. But at the end of the day, the most frustrating thing about about the recall election was the lack of accountability. Morehouse, Salmon, Fudge, once it was all over, were just kind of like, well, let's move forward and let's get back to business. And didn't really stand up to the fact that a unwanted recall for democratically elected officials is, again, like, I can't think of a better term than bureaucratic bullying. And I can't help but wonder if things might be different in Windsor today had those three really taken a stand against that misuse of people's time and money. You could say, even though the bullies lost the battle, the door was left open for them to win the war. And while I could not find evidence that Maureen Merrill was directly involved in the recall, the Chamber of Commerce certainly entertained the idea of getting involved in the recall. And Maureen Merrill has become a very active member of the Chamber of Commerce. So when Morehouse, Sam, and Fudge expressed concern that the Chamber of Commerce would weigh in on the recall not in their favor, John Lewis, then president of the Windsor Chamber, said if they, Windsor Town Council members, are pro-business, they have nothing to fear. And so while even though the Chamber ultimately didn't weigh in on the recall, there was some writing on the wall. In summary, in the wake of her defeat, Maureen Merrill slandered, though she retracted her slander, a political opponent, and then she was whining in the Press Democrat about her reputation while Windsor was having an all-out brawl of a recall election. So I would say she did not handle defeat well. Chapter 4. Friend of Foppoli and Frenemy of Fudge. Okay, it's a new day. It's a new floral blazer. Yes, I did already own 2 floral blazers before I realized they would be coming in handy for this Maureen Merrill episode. So this chapter is all about Maureen Merrill's ties to the people that the public of Windsor probably consider the most corrupt, Dominic Foppoli and Debora Fudge. And as I'm sure you're sick of hearing me say, in 2021, Mayor Dominic Foppoli resigned in disgrace following now 14 allegations of sexual assault going public against him. And given that Windsor is a small town, small town vibe, everybody knows your name, everybody knows your business, a very obvious question to ask is which Windsor leaders could have stopped this? Because I think when you are aspiring towards living in a, cute, small, cozy town, you would think that your leaders would be able to prevent something like that from happening. And I think it's especially pressing because Foppoli still roams free. They need to be showing us that they've learned and they're prioritizing keeping us safe. So let's jump ahead to 2004. Between then, Maureen was out of politics. She was doing a lot of work for Rotary International. I was graduating from junior high, and Dominic Foppoli was a college student taking time off to run for office / try and get a reality TV show. And I quote, "The 21-year-old Windsor resident is getting media attention because of his youth. MTV's Rock the Vote has come calling, and production companies are talking about a reality show." I mean, if he'd won, would that have been a reality show? I legitimately do not think I had ever conceptualized of his first campaign in 2004 when he was still in college as a publicity stunt, but duh. Another fun fact I learned this time around is that in this campaign where he was running in a Republican primary, he distinguished himself amongst the other Republicans by being super anti-abortion, which does not age particularly well, given what just happened with Roe v. Wade. I can only speculate that Merill and Foppoli were on each other's radars at that time. They were both public figures by choice. They were representing Rotary International and writing letters to the editor in Maureen Merrill's case. And Dominic Foppoli was trying to get a reality show. How much more attention-seeking can you be? However, Dominic Foppoli was an enthusiastic George W. Bush Republican president intern, and Maureen Merrill describes herself as a John Kerry voting Democrat. However, she does also publicly discuss supporting the occasional fiscally responsible conservative. By 2006, and the first year Dominic Foppoli ran for town council, it seemed like Windsor was finally settling into the idyllic vision put forward by the original founders, Citizens for Windsor, and that the voters, who at least voted for incorporation, really genuinely seemed to want to see play out for their home. The PD editorial board writes, Windsor has much to celebrate these days. Residents suddenly find themselves with a vibrant downtown, a flourishing community gathering spot, the town green, and a common vision for the future. These things didn't happen overnight. They were the culmination of years of good planning, sound execution, and wise leadership. So here's where I can weigh in and offer my perspective as someone whose family has owned 2 businesses in that flourishing downtown. I once went to like a public input study on the boutique hotel projects, like this was in the 2010s. The point I want to make about attending this public feedback session, to me, as someone who, as part of my college degree, I had to learn a lot about data collection, and it just, we were putting post-it notes on pictures. It just didn't seem really conducive to getting a clear picture of what the people that attended this meeting wanted. And it was an out-of-town consultant who was conducting it, and I just really felt like he was just like this big city guy taking advantage of a naive small town. It was very embarrassing, that experience. And so it makes me reticent to say, despite the fact that I do think in 2006 there is something to be said about the potential success of the downtown, that it was because of wise leadership. So in that 2006 election, Dominic Foppoli's first election and an election where the downtown green is being celebrated as a success, Debora Fudge was in rare form. She sent 6,000 mailers in favor of candidates Salmon and Robin Goebel. And this mailer claimed that Salmon and Goebel's opponents were backed by developers and would ruin the progress of Windsor by returning it to the days of urban sprawl. And I have to, in this case, agree with Salmon's take on the situation. Salmon on Tuesday said he sees the controversy as part of a carryover from Fudge's unsuccessful race for county supervisor, in which she narrowly lost the election to Paul Kelly in June. It pitted 2 groups against each other, said Salmon, the environmental versus the development community. But isn't that what's been happening in Windsor since 1992? Though not running for office in that particular election, Merill was still in the paper representing Windsor. In an article, Just Don't Call It a City, which I clearly had an emotional reaction to, Maureen actually explains the founder's decision for insisting on calling Windsor a town. It sounded homier, which is exactly the kind of brand manager response you would expect from someone who has no experience in politics, but all experience in business. This love of Windsor's hominess seems to be the only thing that can bring the developers and the environmentalists together, thus rallying them around the family-oriented small businesses on the downtown green. At least that's my take. At that time, my family only owned 1 business. We did not own Images yet. It was actually one of the first businesses to open up on the Windsor Town Green. It was Ubiquitous, the beat store. Due to the homophobia in Windsor, when I worked there, I was careful not to disclose that my parents were LGBT until I was sure people were safe to tell that to. And that wasn't just, my parents in my head or anything like that. In 2008, there was an anti-gay marriage initiative on the California ballot, Prop 8, which really gave Windsor an opportunity to show me how unwelcome me and my family were in town. I forget for how many days in a row it was. There was a time where every single day when I was getting on the 101 to go to school, that I saw the Yes on 8 crowd, the anti-gay marriage crowd, with their signs and their pom-poms at the on-ramp to the 101. It has been alleged that Maureen Merrill herself wrote a homophobic letter to the editor published in the Windsor Times in this 2008 election. I am not aware of internet archives of the Windsor Times. There is a UC library, I forget where I could access the microfilm. I am not afraid to do that. I just don't have time right now. But I believe it after reading all of her other letters to the editor. She has some very strange things to say when it comes to social issues. I absolutely believe that she would have written a homophobic letter to the editor as recently as 2008. Now, my frustration with the more bigoted elements of Windsor aside, our businesses survived because of locals. And to this day, some of the best friends that I made in Windsor, I met through my businesses. So I am very grateful to the community, to the people of Windsor for that, for keeping me fed and sheltered. And what that showed me was, at the end of the day, what we all wanted, what we could get on the same page about, was we want the town green and the downtown to succeed. And in 2008, Merill took the time to write the Press Democrat about the issues that really matter. Her reputation. It was very important to her that not just Salmon, Fudge, and Morehouse, but also all the founding town council members, so including her, get credit for the success of the downtown. With all sides relying on the success of the downtown to bolster their image, no wonder they ignored signs the downtown needed more hands-on care in order to stay alive. For example, after the bank seized the properties and put them up for sale, Debora Fudge praised local business owners who were able to scoop up their places of business and actually own them, meaning they wouldn't have to pay rent to a landlord in the future, which that can really save on business expenses. One of the businesses to take advantage of this was Tomi Thai, the beloved Thai restaurant that still has maybe my favorite peanut sauce I have ever had. But the little guys weren't the only ones snatching up property. There have always been predatory organizations snatching up cheap houses during economic crises. And as much as I have my issues with Warren Thiessen, I do have to agree with him when he said the negative impact on housing development was the most underreported story of the Great Recession. Because we went into this recession with kind of this slow the growth mindset that had slowed growth, but there was already a need for more affordable and moderately priced housing. By 2008, here's how the PD was reflecting on it. The Great Recession scarred Sonoma County in ways that are still painful a decade later. The loss of middle-income jobs, homeowners forced to be renters, rising debt for college and cars, even longer commutes, underfunded and terminated pensions, the high cost and scarcity of credit, even drug addiction are still lasting impacts of the financial crisis of 2008. One of the most damaging outcomes of all, especially after the October 2017 wildfires, may be the housing that didn't get built because developers couldn't get financing and homebuyers couldn't get home loans. Had construction continued unabated, more than 10,400 additional homes would have been built in Sonoma County between 2008 and 2017, a Press Democrat analysis found. Not only did the recession slow the development of especially much needed affordable housing, the lack of funding for projects made people less interested in running for town council. There was nothing to do. In 2014, the economy started to pick up, Windsor started to have projects, and Foppoli ran for town council. Debora Fudge once again made a bid for Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, and seemed poised to do so after narrowly defeating newcomer James Gore in the primary. Let's start with Foppoli's campaign. First of all, he won. Second of all, his main thing seemed to be the promise of a boutique hotel, whatever that means. So yeah, Foppoli won. Fudge didn't have such a good time. As I mentioned, she narrowly won the June primary against James Gore. Following this defeat, Maureen Merrill, along with former Windsor mayors Bruce Okrepke, Steve Allen, Robin Goebel, and many other local public figures, they threw their money and their endorsements behind James Gore, who had no experience in local government but had served for the Obama administration as an assistant chief of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And it seemed that people liked the idea of someone who was new, fresh, and therefore wasn't part of all of these bitter rivalries, and he had, experience in the Obama administration, which made him appealing to folks on the left of the political spectrum, but he was a businessman. So that made him less alarming to people on the right end of the spectrum. And the PD said that it was, probably a gut punch to Debora Fudge to see her colleagues rally around her political opponent like that. While Fudge was at her most vulnerable, master manipulator Dominic Foppoli swooped in and was giving her red carpet tastings at Christopher Creek Winery. Not that I feel particularly sorry for her at this point, I just found it interesting. By 2016, Debora Fudge made her triumphant return to Windsor Town Council. Her grace rewarded, finally, with the endorsement she craved from her colleagues. She even got an endorsement from Maureen Merrill. In a November 6th letter to the editor, Maureen Merrill writes of Bruce O'Krepke and Debora Fudge, Bruce O'Krepke being the new leader and Debora Fudge being the old leader, to do a good job. New and veteran council members need deep engagement and real knowledge on a broad range of local issues. Windsor is succeeding with a culture of solid policy, neighborly communication, and stability in our approach to complex matters. Over time, the boutique hotel Foppoli had promised seems to have morphed into the Civic Center project. The Civic Center project, of course, including a hotel, but also more public good buildings. And this seems like a project that was really symbolic of the hope that historical team, environmental and historic team, we're not developers, we're just real people of Windsor, but we want development that will benefit us financially, could get on the same page about, because Debora Fudge was on it. However, Fudge really seems to lose her environmentalist cred here, because she and Foppoli were really gung-ho about developer Robert Greene, who received a $6.4 million fine by state water quality regulators for environmental violations during the construction of an ultra-luxury resort, Montage Healdsburg, and Healdsburg is the next city north of Windsor. So now that I've given you the deep dive into Debora Fudge's psychology that no one asked for, let's remind ourselves Maureen Merrill and Dominic Foppoli's financial interests are actually very intertwined. Maureen owns the unit that houses Mutt Lynch Winery, as well as the unit that used to house Images on the Windsor Town Green, my store, that's where she was my landlady. And these units are both like within a block and a half of the unit Foppoli, I believe, owns that housed his former brewery, Old Redwood Brewing Company. Notably, Foppoli himself eventually had to start recusing himself from votes on downtown development projects because of the close vicinity of his businesses. As a business person myself, I can't help but wonder if Maureen's love for Foppoli had anything to do with how much she also stood to gain from the boutique hotel and eventual civic center projects that he hoped to bring to Windsor. After all, if Foppoli was successful in creating a destination brewery in Windsor, the increased traffic to Windsor, to those blocks, would absolutely increase the property value of those units housing a winery, which theoretically would also financially benefit from alcohol-related tourism, and the gift shop Images. We certainly had a way to market ourselves to tourists. We sold jewelry made by local artists. So Images too, a gift shop on the green, stood to benefit from a destination brewery. And I have to imagine, given that one of his business partners was the James Bald of wine, Jean-Charles Boisset, that this wasn't meant to be some cute little brewery. This was meant to be a booming success that really made its mark on the beer industry. And if a alleged sexual predator mayor and a former town council member financially benefiting from these projects doesn't sound corrupt enough, let's just throw in the fact Dominic Foppoli's other business partner in the brewery was Clay Fritz, yes, proprietor of Fritz Underground Winery, also a Windsor planning commissioner. So that's actually two government officials owning a brewery that's going to benefit from development projects. And a multi-millionaire flamboyant French guy. Totally normal stuff. Given how much money Maureen and others stand to make off of these projects, it just does smell like a recipe for corrupt acts, like turning a blind eye to allegations of sexual violence against the politician who most represents the possibility of these dreams coming true. Let's review the times that brave folks made an attempt to put the allegations against Dominic Foppoli on the public record. Bruce O'Krepke, as a member of Active 2030 number 50, had an opportunity to sniff out Foppoli, as it were. Both were members not just of the the international social club Active 2030, but of specifically the number 50 Santa Rosa Club, one of the few all-men's clubs left. Overall, the club is co-ed. And you can learn all about Active 2030 in the San Francisco Chronicle article, A Drinking Club with a Charity Problem. Tells you a lot just there in the title. And I also made an entire video about them called A Safe Space for Predators, so I'm not going to rehash those. Active 2030 is bad. And so in my experience, when I was a prospective, meaning like trial member of Active 2030 back in about 2015, people were very open about their experiences with Dominic Foppoli so that as many people as possible would be aware of those allegations and could keep their distance to keep themselves safe. So, given that we know that within Active 2030, people were very actively trying to make the allegations against Dominic Foppoli known, there was an opportunity there to sniff him out if that was something people were looking for. It was all right there. And you may be saying, okay, Ray, but that's a long time ago. And the way Active 2030 works, the 2030 is for like you're in your 20s and your 30s when you're in Active 2030. And so you age out once you turn 40. Bruce was, you know, older when he got onto the Windsor Town Council scene. And so yes, he would have been aged out. His son, Jeff, would not. I would assume that Okrepke's connections to Foppoli through Active 2030 were part of how Foppoli landed his Windsor Planning Commission role. The whole point of Active 2030 is, you know, the networking, the socializing, the networking of business people. And then one of the club mottos per the San Francisco Chronicle is, if we all stay dirty, we all stay clean, which indicates that there's a culture of people knowing all each other's dirt. Like maybe Dominic Foppoli is a rapist with a rape castle, which they acknowledge that he has a rape castle. Again, just read the San Francisco Chronicle article. But since they all know each other's dirt, it doesn't matter. And that's part of the brotherhood. At best, this was a missed opportunity by design. Bruce Okrepke was a part of that, and he helped Active 2030 do exactly what it was supposed to do, which is get its members into positions of power regardless of the content of their character. Although, perhaps Bruce Okrepke's ties to Active 2030 are why he's actually one of the few town council members to even claim he pushed for a more formal investigation. And town council members had two opportunities to really push to make change happen in 2017 and 2020. And again, we're not talking about legal obligation here, anything like that. We are talking about an ethical obligation as an elected official to stop a rapist, to stop an alleged rapist. And if you want to hide behind the legality like Debora Fudge has, well, that tells you a lot about someone's ethics, someone's code of ethics, doesn't it? And so yes, per San Francisco Chronicle reporting, town council officials, including both Sam Salmon, our current mayor and current candidate for District 2 against Merill, and Debora Fudge, current town council member and, you know, a supporter of Maureen Merrill, they received these notices and they have not responded, in my mind, appropriately. This is a situation where you can expect your elected officials to go above and beyond for the protection of their community, especially one that's trying to be family-oriented and safe. However, even before the 2017 and 2020 letters directly to town council, I can now share that specifically the person that I went to in 2015 to try and warn about Foppoli was Maureen Merrill's current campaign secretary, Karen Alves, who her main title in Windsor previously is she's just a citizen, and she's featured on the town website as a Windsor Wonder Woman, really representing the good citizens of Windsor. So someone who I went to in 2015 to personally try and warn about Foppoli and to do something for the people of Windsor, and I went to her because I knew that she was kind of a powerful community figure. She was a customer. She was kind of trying to, you know, position herself as someone welcoming me back into the Windsor community. I was, you know, a recent college grad, and I trusted her to care about me and do the right thing. And she was just mean. Like, she called me a gossip. She said that, you know, she's friends with Foppoli and how dare I say these things about them. It was a really invalidating and, like, in retrospect,
retrospect, just like really upsetting conversation that really just changed my relationship with Windsor. Yeah, that it was just so hard to do what to me is just a very clear right thing to do and try and bring a rapist to justice, to try and bring an alleged rapist to justice. So just a year later in 2016, Karen Alves actually posted Maureen Merrill's endorsement of Okrepke and Fudge, at that point allies of Foppoli, on my Facebook page, which would be outlandish enough even if Maureen Merrill weren't my landlady. It's just the level of pressure put on me, and I had less power than them. They were a customer and a landlady. They absolutely had power and sway over me at that time. And them not being my customer and my landlady, now that Images has sadly closed, does make this YouTube channel a lot more possible. Make no mistake. And then in 2020, Karen Alves continued to defend Foppoli when I made a Facebook status calling him an embarrassment. Karen Alves, ladies and gentlemen, if Dominic Foppoli is an embarrassment, then so am I. I don't need to say anything because she already said it so beautifully. So yeah, you will have to forgive me if my disdain for Maureen's campaign is personal. They have been calling me crazy for wanting to do something about Foppoli since 2015. And that is what's being implied by Debora Fudge calling me an unwell person. That my actually caring about long-term consequences and ending rape culture so that people like Dominic Foppoli don't continue to get away with things, that this makes me crazy. Their insistence that I am crazy, that's actual gaslighting. That is a term that gets overused a lot, but them trying to convince me and any of us that are angry at them that we're crazy and there's something wrong with us, like that is actually what gaslighting is. It's when you try to make people think they're crazy for things that don't actually make them crazy. That's what it actually is, FYI. Oh, and I always forget that besides the 2017 and 2020 emails to town council, in 2019, in the heat of the Me Too movement, there was also a Twitter thread about Dominic Foppoli. And it is very important to remember that Dominic Foppoli's mother, when she saw this thread, she, called Foppoli in tears, which led him to start harassing the brave woman who had come forward to try to get her to take down the tweets. And you can see this more in the videos that I've made about Foppoli in the past, but there is clearly a way in which his family has enabled his behavior. Like, it's awkward, but like, it's a small town. It's been since college that Foppoli has been doing this. There are ways in which his family is responsible for this, for harboring him and enabling him, and still it seems like defending him even after all this. And I say that it's important to note that now because I think a lot of us needed, with Maureen Merrill, who is so entrenched in the establishment that supported and protected Foppoli as one of the candidates for District 2, we really needed Salmon to step up. But no, he confirmed to me that he went to Dominic Foppoli's birthday party because he has so much compassion for the parents who allowed this to happen on their watch, and not for the people of Windsor, that in order to feel closure, we need to know that Foppoli's days of power and influence, not just him, but that whole family, is over. And I 100% believe that his parents asking Salmon to come to the birthday party was a power move, was a way of the family trying to send a message to the people of Windsor that they still run this town. It's frustrating and it's disappointing, and it's frustrating and disappointing that this is where I have to end the story. It does not transition into the case for Salmon. It transitions into the case for Windsor residents, Windsor voters, to really take a step back and think about, well, what do we want Windsor's legacy to be? So in conclusion for this chapter, Maureen Merrill has had a tumultuous relationship with Debora Fudge, but they're friends. They're friends now. And she has always had a friendly relationship with Dominic Foppoli. Congratulations, you made it to the conclusion. I think we're all too exhausted to take a super detailed look into Maureen Merrill's campaign finance reports. Full disclosure, when I made this video, I thought I'd have time to do a part 2 where we did that. I'm sorry, that's not happening.
but I've spent some time looking at them, and the general point is this. She hasn't changed. She's raising a ton of money. She's gotten donations from developers that have been discussed in this video. She's spending money on those mailers that I hate. And, you know, she's also financing a lot of her own campaign the same way she did in her first bid for town council. Part of the reason I'm not super enthusiastic to keep making content about Maureen Merrill is that Salmon really let me down. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that I didn't have a moment where I tried to get on the Salmon train because I just wanted so badly for there to be a solid, positive alternative to Maureen. But at the end of the day, you have no good options. And I am just so sorry that is the position you find yourself in. I have so much sympathy for you. The hard truth is that Windsor's problems aren't new, and they won't change until the system we're working within isn't the one built by and for the people that are trying to milk Windsor for as much personal profit as they can. If I lived in Windsor and thought there was a snowball's chance in hell of this happening, I would push for basically a redo on incorporation proposals, kind of like a constitutional convention. But I think Windsor would have to get a lot more activisty before a solution like that would be viable, because it would take a lot of time and effort. And even if there was a movement for that, especially after reflecting on like my life in Windsor, I don't think that the current residents of Windsor would envision an ideal community for themselves that would have room for me. I don't think the average Windsor resident is ready to have a conversation about their personal history of racism, sexism, homophobia that I would need to have with them in order to feel safe building a community with them. Windsor didn't even have a gay pride until this year, right? And it was very symbolic of why this LGBTQI human has moved on from Windsor and is going to stay moved on. The Grand Marshal was a Foppoli enabler that I've talked about before, Maureen Merrill, and the most popular photo that I saw circulating on social media was of a cop interacting with a child, which I'm not going to share out of, respect for the child. And like, if that's the pride you want to have, Windsor, fine. I'm not going to fight with you anymore. But that pride was an insult to the anti-police riot, the Stonewall riot that was the first pride. And that's not up for debate. No, thank you. I am telling you that. And as much as I've tried to convince myself that it hasn't, not wanting to scare off the more socially conservative element in Windsor has changed my content. Even in this video, I didn't go in on Sonoma County Supervisor Nick Esposti as much as I really wanted to. I'd imagine to the average Windsor resident, in the grand scheme of things, he doesn't seem like that much of a villain. Now for me, I have as much disdain for him as I do for Debora Fudge. Let me explain. While I was grabbing screenshots of another article, I couldn't help but notice this headline: gays to get official recognition. This caught my eye because, as the queer daughter of lesbians who lived in Sonoma County in 1992, I was flabbergasted by the thought that they weren't even recognized yet in 1992. I mean, I was 2 years old. Anyway, Nick Esposti voted against having gay pride in Sonoma County. And by then, gay pride was starting to be increasingly common. He lost, but he did vote against it. And in voting against it, he said it was because Sonoma County shouldn't be endorsing a lifestyle. Disrespectfully, embrace yourself, I'm about to swear. Fuck off with that bullshit, Nick Esposti. Social conservatism's ahistorical and ascientific assertion that every person is either a man or a woman, and their narrow definitions of what a man and a woman are, is the lifestyle, not the mere existence, the observable, scientifically proven existence of non-binary people and a large diversity of manifestations of what it means to be male and female. And I don't have to entertain the notion that it was a different time in the 90s and that I'm taking my eye off the prize by focusing on homophobia in the 90s instead of focusing on Dominic Foppoli, because guess what? This is my channel and I can do what I want. And so if it isn't abundantly clear, in making this video, the clearest conclusion that I could come to was that I need to break up with Windsor politics. politics, which obviously is a scary conclusion given how much it probably already has alienated my viewers. Another factor in wanting to step back from Windsor was how awful it felt to rip the band-aid off and start talking about Esther Lemus's mayoral campaign. Esther Lemus, of course, has accused Dominic Foppoli of sexual assault. She's one of the plaintiffs in the first civil suit that was filed against him. But, you know, I've always been nervous about covering her specifically because I've always been aware of her political ties to Foppoli's enablers, and that's complicated. And the internet doesn't handle complicated particularly well. So it's been really hard for me, and I haven't been able to produce content to my standard. It's very telling, again, of why I need to break up with Windsor politics, that someone I saw as an inherent ally in the fight to end rape culture, like Lemus, has now endorsed Maureen Merrill. To me, that means Lemus is yet another Windsor politician who thinks moving forward means compromising with bullies. You know, the same way Salmon and Debora Fudge did after they faced that ridiculous recall. If you don't stand up to bullies, they're gonna keep bullying you. Definitely reflective of my anxiety around the topic of Esther Lemus's continued political career, as I said that she had received a donation from Richard Coons for her mayoral election, but actually it was a previous town council election. However, you know, when I went back to double check that, I did see she had received donations from Larry Wassam and Richard Carnation, and what had made Richard Coons bad was his ties to those two. So I almost just had to kick myself because I was like, oh my god, if I had had my dates right, then I would have had an even better case, not that I like making it, that Lemus has ties to some of the, more corrupt developers. I mean, they did a kind of slanderous thing, so I feel comfortable calling them corrupt. And I think the reason it makes me sick is I'm terrified that their proximity to Foppoli's enablers, and when I say they, I don't just mean Esther Lemus, obviously. I mean Esther Lemus and her attorney, Tracy Carrillo. Tracy Carrillo did not need to go endorsing Maureen Merrill. Like, is she even a Windsor resident? I don't understand. I'm worried that their proximity to Foppoli's corrupt enablers could be used, might just alter public perception of the case. I've just spent too much time studying rape culture not to obsess over how these kinds of suits play out in the media. I think any of you that have the stomach to follow the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial know what I'm talking about. Please don't twist my concern about public perception into me saying that I don't believe Esther Lemus or any of the other women. I 100% still believe. Honestly, Lemus's political ties to all of these people just tell me she was the one who had the most to lose in coming forward. Hence my trouble criticizing her for fighting to keep what she stood to lose in coming forward. Okay, let's wrap up and get back to my feelings about Maureen and the town of Windsor from a political perspective. From Windsor's founding in the 90s, Maureen clearly was part of a nebulous coalition with some formal ties and some informal ties who wanted to get control over Windsor essentially before the county sold everything off. Which honestly would have been fine had they not also been seeking control because their businesses, for example, Mike Merrill's bank that I discussed, would profit immensely from the development of Windsor. And I hope your takeaway would not be that Maureen sucks. I mean, although she does, but that the nebulous coalition sucks. And if you want to effectively fight back against corruption, you can't just fight individual people like Foppoli, Fudge, Merill, or individual issues like the Civic Center project. You have to come up with a strategy that fights back against all of it, like LGBTQ people were doing at the time of the Stonewall riot. My very existence, a daughter of LGBTQ people, is proof that victories were had. You have to especially fight back against the major donors who keep a low public profile. Those can be the ones with the most influence and the most to hide, hence them hiding behind a low profile. So that's my advice. Stop trying to make change for these expensive, confusing elections where the candidates are people that don't care about you. That's playing into the culture they created in the very first election. Audre Lorde has a whole book of essays on this principle. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And believe me, I know. Dismantling systems of oppression is easier said than done. But I believe in the power of the people to figure it out. So truly, I do wish the people of Windsor the best when it comes to electoral politics, but for now, I'm out. but I still hope you'll stay supporters of the channel. For me, I'm gonna go on a final indefinite hiatus until I learn how to make those corruption web videos I've been threatening for so long now. So until my next video, I hope you still love me. XOXO.